Hello, friends, and welcome to the November 15th edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about public policy issues here in the great state of Texas and have a conversation about how you can engage in the process. My name is Scott Adnip, your host and Texas Impact's Engagement Director, and today's episode is brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas and Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas. And honestly, y'all, today is an episode I wish we didn't have to have, but it is an important one nonetheless. Recently, Texas has seen an uptick in anti-Semitism, including a rash of activities in Central Texas, including an act of arson at the Congregation Beth Israel Temple in Austin. Obviously, we are horrified by these actions and plan on saying more about how we can talk to our elected officials about this in the weeks to come. But today, wanted to start a conversation about anti-Semitism in Texas with our panel. And joining us for this important conversation are two Texas Impact board members, Rabbi Neil Blumofe with Congregational Agudas Achim in Austin. Hey, Neil. And Rabbi Nancy Kasten with Faith Commons in Dallas. Hey, Nancy, thanks for being with us. We also have with us Renee Lafair with the Anti-Defamation League in Austin. Hey, Renee. And last but not least, Reverend Jonathan Page with First Congregational Church of Houston. And friends, I am really grateful that y'all were willing to take the time to be with us today. Let's jump right in with the rabbi closest to the action in Austin. Neil, starting with you, congregations in Austin have been a victim of a significant act of vandalism in the last couple of weeks. But this was part of a larger series of anti-Semitic acts in Central Texas, which impacted San Antonio, San Marcos, and Austin. Can you just start out by helping us understand the scope of what's been happening over the course of the last few weeks?
For sure. Thank you so much, Scott. And thank you very much to you and the Texas Impact family for making this happen. We recognize that anti-Semitism and many forms of hate exist really just under the surface of our so-called civilized society. And when provocateurs might come either from out of state or homegrown and begin to scratch that surface, it seems to give permission to many to enact a particular way of expressing themselves that is deleterious to our community and really begins to manifest or become something much bigger. And that is why I think we've pivoted very much to gaining solidarity and alliance among many organizations, civic organizations, government officials, business partners, lots of people who speak very forcefully and very publicly against anti-Semitism and hate regarding certainly in support of the Jewish community and really making sure that this hatred does not metastasize further. I can tell you more directly about what was going on. There was a protest against a night for Israel at the Cornerstone Church of John Hagee's in San Antonio. There were banner hangs of things in Austin, leaflets being distributed, different things happening in Austin that disrupted traffic and were intimidating. In San Marcos, there were flyers that were left on yards of Jewish people and others, and other rhetorical things happening in Texas State, in the Texas State community. And I'm very pleased to say that with partners' help, including Renee Lafair and the Anti-Defamation League, as well as interfaith groups, I know that Rabbi Kasten represents Faith Commons in Dallas. We have IACT, which is Interfaith Action of Central Texas, based in Austin, have done very important work in bringing together a wide variety of people who have spoken against this and make sure that it goes back to the fringes and to the darknesses where it belongs.
Well, thanks for framing us in the conversation. Nancy, I'm going to bring you in next, Rabbi Kasten. So anti-Semitism isn't just showing up in physical acts, right? But also in policy. And we keep hearing from elected officials or administrators who are trying to minimize both this anti-Semitic behavior, through actions like we saw in Southlake, where a school suggested that teachers needed to teach both sides of the Holocaust. But we're also talking about anti-Semitism today because we want to draw attention to these horrific acts. But can you talk some about anti-Semitic behavior you see, but also how some leaders are trying to minimize or excuse these harmful acts against groups of people, including the Jewish community, but also other marginalized communities?
I honestly think it's kind of dangerous to generalize in a way. I think there is a lot of different kinds of anti-Semitism that is being exhibited, and maybe the better term for it is Jew hatred rather than anti-Semitism, because it isn't, a state-sponsored, policy of discrimination against all people who have, Jewish lineage, for example, the way it was in Nazi Germany. I think that, we have people who, act out in different ways through different groups. And Renee is, much more of an expert in this than I am. But, we have high school and college fraternities or groups making anti-Semitic slurs, muttering under their breath on the football field. We have that kind of thing. We have the kinds of attacks that Rabbi Blumofe talked about that are, more physical and violent. We have lots of online hate speech. Some of it is directed toward people who support Israel. There are just a lot of variations on the theme. Again, Renee, you should correct me if I'm wrong, but what I see in terms of policy in Texas, in large measure, is support for Jews who are under attack when it comes to any kind of attack on by Holocaust deniers or by people who are critical of Israel. Just this past June, our governor signed into law a bill 3257, which created the Texas Holocaust, Genocide, and Anti-Semitism Advisory Commission. This follows up on his declaration a couple of years ago that, Holocaust education should be taught in public schools. So, I think that that in terms of policy and, Carroll ISD, nothing ever came to an actual policy. And to me, that issue of how politics ends up infiltrating school decision-making, school board decisions, Texas, standards for education, that's a problem that's much bigger than the problem of anti-Semitism.
I just want to amplify Rabbi Kasten's point. When we have spoken with our students, following up about the anti-Semitism, and we asked our students who go to a range of schools, including high schools, all throughout Central Texas, from the north suburbs of Austin to the south, pretty much to a student, every one of them had experienced anti-Jewish behavior in their classrooms from students, or even in some cases from community members, whether it's administration or otherwise. So it's a pretty insidious issue, and I think that it's not an isolated thing that happened to come to town. I think it's something that, again, if you scratch the surface, it's there all along.
Well, Renee, I'd like to bring you into the conversation because both of our first two speakers have referenced your expertise, and so we're really grateful that you're here today. But this is your work day to day, and it's not something that has just surfaced over the course of the last week or two. So how is and how does the Anti-Defamation League respond, and what do you wish listeners would know or do?
Okay, so let's start with. I would say that, first of all, just so in case people don't know, the Anti-Defamation League has a two-pronged mission. The first half of the mission is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people. And the second half is and secure justice and fair treatment for all. And the reason that you have both parts of that mission and they're equally important in our eyes is because unless everyone has justice and fair treatment, no one is safe in society. So the wisdom of our founders in 1913 led to that mission, which has not changed to this day. So in other words, so then basically though, over time you look at like, how do you fight hate? You know, what is the bottom line is, how do you fight hate? And I would say that when I'm listening to this conversation so far today, that the thing that we do and that we try to help people with, number one, is we study it. We try to understand it. So, for example, when you look at society as a whole, and what Nancy and Neil were talking about, if you look, we have a construct called the pyramid of hate. And the pyramid of hate is basically, it's a single picture. Everyone can look it up. It's a single picture, you know, Google pyramid of hate, ADL, and it's the first link. And it basically shows what happens when hate escalates in society. And what I think that one of the concerns that everyone is having right now, and this is not just anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism does not operate in a vacuum. There's all sorts of hate in society right now, and I can give you reasons why we think that that's happening. But the worst thing that happens when hate is when society unravels and you end up with a genocide. But you can't get to genocide without all of the ones below it. And those are bias motivated violence. And then below that is discrimination, and then acts of bias, and then biased attitudes. So that our work, what we try and do is try and keep hate as low on this pyramid as possible. And what I think was so disconcerting about what's happened in Austin the last 3 to 4 weeks was where we had a graffiti in high school and we had this outside group of people who were just honestly trying to stir the pot and trying to get attention. That is what their goal was. It moved up to, you know, acts of bias and discrimination. And then the end of the week was when the arson took place. That is like bias motivated violence right there. So our worry is, how do we keep things low? So the way that we do that is we research these things and we try to understand not only the construct of how does hate work, but what are the groups behind it, and how are, you know, what are their tactics? What does law enforcement need to know? What do our communities need to know, and what do our legislators need to know in order to combat this? And that's kind of, I would say, overall, like the big 30,000-foot view of how we look at this.
And so we'll jump into this later with give everybody a chance to answer this one. But what do you hope that people who are listening would do next? What do you hope people would?
Well, I think what Neil did with IACT of Central Texas, which was come up with a letter that clergy from all around town signed. I don't know, there were the last time I checked, there were over 500 signatories of business leaders and faith leaders and all sorts of leaders. That is to have a community-wide response. What that does, number one, is it makes leaders aware that there are issues. And number two, they take a leadership role in saying this is not okay. That's one thing. Another thing is leaders have to speak out. It has to come from the top of what is acceptable and what is not. And then three, you need to give the community ways to heal and process and try and figure it out. But I'm going to add a caveat. Now that we're kind of in a social media world where news is more driven by social media in some ways than by standard media, this becomes super tricky. So for example, you want to speak up against, let's say, this group that came to town, but you don't want to give them any more oxygen or any more attention because that's exactly what they're after. So how do you walk that fine line? And that's like a question that's ever evolving. And does that make sense?
It does. And I want to bring Reverend Jonathan Page into the conversation now. And maybe this next question for him will be a layup now that I just ask you what people should do. But Jonathan, how do you respond to the stories that you've heard so far? And as a Christian pastor in a state that is dominated by churches on many corners, how can Christian communities be more attuned to what's happening to our Jewish neighbors? And how do you wish your clergy colleagues would be responding?
I think there are a couple of things that come up that come to mind. One is just the general sort of the general hope that I have is that any faith community, certainly any Christian faith community, in response to this, not only would speak up against it and obviously condemn it in strong language, but also to Renee's point and others' points. I mean, part of it is trying to build a mentality and a sort of atmosphere of mutual understanding, of speaking across boundaries, of sort of stepping away from hateful language in any context. I mean, especially in a highly politicized world, I think it's much more likely for people from the pulpit to start using like really strong language around politics, around political opponents in a way that demonizes them. And as Renee was saying with her pyramid of hate, when you start with that kind of language, that feeds into this type of dynamic. And so not only is there sort of the obvious condemnation of any Semitic acts, but more importantly, how do we as faith leaders sort of get at the root sense of hate as it shows up? I mean, one of the things is anti-Semitism in the West is sort of the oldest form of hatred. Certainly and you look at the sort of the role of Christians in this over 2,000 years is shameful, and Christians have to own that. I think many of us have and talked about it. But whenever you see hatred, that's one of the places it's going to go, almost inevitably. And so there's that sense of saying, if you're not actually talking about the sources that are feeding this hate, and that's why, when Renee's talking about the social media stuff, you look at the fact that, the article the other day about how, or a couple of weeks ago, about how, on Facebook, this Facebook employee literally set up an account as like a sort of standard person in North Carolina who was like this conservative house mom. And literally within like no time, she was getting pushed all this QAnon stuff. What do you do when you have a social media environment that pushes people to extremist groups, that highlights these extremist groups? I mean, it's literally set up in order to try and hit that part of your brain that goes to hate. And unless we can start talking about those things, I think we're going to keep seeing incidents like this.
I want to circle back to that in just a second, but I did get a question from friend of the program, Texas Impact board member Ellen, that I wanted to raise specifically to Rabbi Blumofe, because you are serving a congregation in Austin. Is there a message of hope that you offer your congregation after these hateful acts to the larger community? What's your message of hope, or is there one?
Well, I think it's an ever-evolving one, and it's not something that you could say that magically solves issues. Again, these are, as our friends today have said, these are lingering and malingering issues. So on one hand, to be in a position of spiritual leadership, one wants to act as an example, to kind of show that there are partnerships to be made across community, to invest in friendships, and to not let the work or the anxiety or the difficulty that might be happening in a moment, the anguish, to let it consume us, that there is always another day and there's always other ways to begin. And I would say that the statement that was drafted, that was put out by IACT, Interfaith Action of Central Texas, in 36 hours garnered 500 signatures. But after a press conference that we held 2 weeks ago, it has well over 1,500 from people who are very interested in standing. And it has in turn invited others to act as well. The president of the University of Texas signed this note. We have deep and important partnerships with 2 seminaries in Austin, the Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, the Seminary of the Southwest, which is Episcopal, with Houston Tillotson University, which is historically Black college and university. We're deeply involved with this community. The Chancellor of Austin Community College, ACC, put out their own statement. And I know, Scott, that Texas Impact is drafting something as well. So iron sharpens iron, as the book of Proverbs says, and the ways that we continue to show that this is the minimum of how we are going to be in our community is really important. And something I've just said, which I think we can all think about and do as a message of hope, is something I've said before, which is there's a parable of 2 men sitting in a bar, which is why, it's a Jewish parable. It's, so they're there and they're getting together and they're in their cups, as it were. They're drinking, and one guy kind of puts his arm around the other guy and says, "Do you love me?" And the other guy said, "Of course I love you. What kind of a question is that? Yeah, I love you." And then 2 drinks later, the first guy says, "Do you know what causes me pain?" And the second guy kind of is like, "How could I possibly know what causes you pain?" And the first guy starts crying and says, "If you don't know what causes me pain, how could you possibly love me?" And the opportunities that we have, all of us, whether we're spiritual leaders or not, to get to know friends and to get to know community members, that's so very, very important. And it takes a long time. And one of the reasons why I think we were able to respond so strongly is because so many of us in town have invested the time in these kinds of relationships in order, in times of adversity, to bring to fore the many, many years of love that we've considered and started to flow. So a message of hope is a message that we are, things are going to continue to get better as we want to construct the community that we would like to see. And I would encourage all of us to even do these micro acts of love. Invite somebody to your home. The holidays are coming up. Light your Hanukkah menorah with your neighbor. Offer, sing a carol around a tree, or bring somebody into your home for December 24th. There's a lot of different ways to be able to share without judgment and without commission. It's just a way of love and freeform love. And even the invitation, more than the action, means so profoundly to all of us who are looking to keep our community strong and resilient.
I think those are good suggestions. Thank you. And one of the questions somebody sent us in advance was, how can we change the hearts and minds of those who are filled with such hate and rage? And I know everybody on this call, at least that I've had a chance to get to know over the course of the years, is really involved in working with interfaith and community groups. I wonder if you have any other words of advice or suggestions for how we can continue to build movements that share mutual love and respect.
Well, I will just say that, we do this in lots of different ways, and that's important. But I think unless we actually start with ourselves, we're never going to be able to win hearts and influence people. And the ability to recognize our own blindnesses about our own hatred, our own fears, our own discomforts. When we go to meet someone who's different than us, we have to be willing to be uncomfortable. And I think one of the fallacies and tragedies of modern technology is that it just allows us to avoid anything that feels uncomfortable. We can put things we don't like into the box of not like, and put things that we like in the box of like, and then we don't have to deal with nuance. We don't have to deal with the gray area. And we need to, each and every one of us, push ourselves. We can't impact somebody else. All we can do is lead by example and push our own selves to really probe the depths of our own assumptions about who we are and who we are in relationship to others.
But I mean, all of that is 100%. All that's important. Those are all things that we should be doing. Good sources of hope. Without a doubt. But I really do think that the elephant in the room is, like, how are we actually enacting or advocating for policies that, say, for instance, change internet policies? How do we create an environment where the internet is being better policed? We're starting to see that in the last couple of years. If you ask for something that gives me hope, that gives me hope. When I look at 2016 and after, you look at the spike of anti-Semitic sort of incidents that came up after the election of Donald Trump, that was not accidental. There's a political thing going on here. It's driven by a lot of the social media stuff. Until we have regulation of that, and until we actually clamp down on some of those algorithms and any sort of hate speech that we find online, and punish some of these companies that allow that stuff to proliferate, unless that's there, we're going to continue with this for the next however many years. And so I think it's not just us individually reaching out, but also public policy wise, changing some of the structures that are actually fostering the increase in hatred that we're seeing in society today.
Can I go ahead and jump in? Reverend Page, I think that you're absolutely on target there. We have a plan that we're calling Repair, which each acronym stands for a long sentence, so I'm not going to go through that. But the concept is, how do we make social media more accountable for what they do and their impact? Because listening to all of you and watching and how you watch the world through a faith lens, we as society, your faith lens is so important right now, almost as a counterbalance to what people are experiencing, and the rabbit holes that we all of us disappear online, and how do we emerge from those rabbit holes and build community together is kind of, I think, probably what you wrestle with every day. But we're working on, we have a Center on Technology and Society that has been working on this, since I got there. And when we started, no one wanted to talk to us. And we've helped companies develop terms of services, because they're private companies, terms of service that allow them to kick people off that have hate. And now we're trying to encourage them strongly. It used to be nicely, but we're not being as nice anymore, because that didn't work. To work on algorithms. I mean, we just came out with an online hate index that measures hate online, so that we can track it over time and see if there's progress and which direction progress is moving in. So, I mean, we are really wrestling with the things that you are talking about, and trying to, take on this issue of online hate and its repercussions for our day-to-day lives and what you all see every day in your work, right? So, hearing about it from a faith perspective actually is super interesting to me, and I appreciate what you all do every day to kind of counter what people are seeing online, and so it's appreciated. That's all I can say.
So I'm going to give everybody a chance for shameless plugs at the end, but you did just kind of raise a new topic and possible resource. Do you have a place where we can learn more about ADL's work on this?
If you go to ADL or if you could just type in Google ADL repair plan, then you can see there's a video that explains it, and there's a good landing page there where you can look and see what we're doing. But part of the problem is that policy is not able to keep up with the change. The pace of change is so fast that so we're it's all evolving over time. And and it used to be trying to be hand in hand with some of the players, and now it's realizing that we can't. There needs to be more restrictions and more accountability, I think, is where we're moving towards over time, and the repair plan can outline that perfectly.
Perfect, thanks. This last question, or I guess second to last question, is one that our listeners always ask, and there's usually a pretty easy answer. I usually ask speakers, what do you hope people will do next? And if they're talking about, some legislative topic, it's usually call your representative and tell them X, right? It's a little harder to answer on this one, but I do think there are a lot of people around the state who are looking at the increase of acts of anti-Semitism and just asking, what do I do? Right. And you've addressed that somewhat, right? Like we've talked about running the gamut from addressing federal policy on social media companies to hosting a gathering in your home. But I want to give you all just one last chance because people will ask, what do you hope listeners will do leaving today and the weeks and months to come? How do you hope they'll think about this? What do you hope that they'll do? Give you each a chance to take a stab at this one. Rabbi Blumofe, how about we start with you?
Well, thanks. And Reverend Page, I think you raised something quite compelling. However, not to debate that today and with you here, but I think it's a double-edged sword. And I think, as Renee suggested, I think the pace of change is so quick, and to sort of lay it at a particular political election or something, I think is not seeing sort of the larger issue. So Scott, back to your point, one of the things I tried to do in the last year or so is to try to get a contextualization for things. And reading about the history of America after the Civil War, regarding Reconstruction and the backlash of Reconstruction with the compromises in 1870 that led ultimately to World War I. So I guess one thing one can do is continue to be educated and continue to learn and to see that this isn't the first time this kind of thing has happened. And to realize that many ways, and there are many elected leaders in this country who have profited or thrived on this kind of algorithm, if you will, whether it was an algorithm in the 19th century or not. Another thing is to realize that this is not happening in a vacuum. To think that the anti-Semitism in Central Texas is something that is just new and sui generis is not true. There's 2 trials going on in this country, certainly many, but there's one about Charlottesville, which I think is very interesting, regarding what was going on a few years ago. And in Brunswick, Georgia, there's a trial going on regarding the fate of those who killed Ahmaud, or allegedly killed Ahmaud Arbery. And I think that connecting these dots and recognizing how we can see that, again, this is a metastasized disease, yet how we can find our way to stand strong against it, and to stand strong against antagonism by building an allied network and building the friendships, true friendships that I spoke about, and not shying away from this kind of alliance building is very, very important. So I would hope that organizations like Texas Impact, which do really, really good work, can continue to be leaders in suggesting articles that are not specifically politically based, but just to read. And even the work of Jill Lepore, who's an incredible historian, is just great to read, and without wading into some of the other debates that are happening in American society. Just read books and see that we are not alone, and that times like these deserve a celebration of what Rabbi Jonathan Sachs calls dignity of difference, and to recognize how we are all, in a way, connected, even especially in our differences. So to get to work in this kind of way, it is grueling, exhausting, and sometimes really, really hard. And yet there is no alternative to construct the kind of society and groups that we want to have to flourish together.
Thanks, Rabbi. And I'll volunteer to buy the first round of soft drinks for a conversation with you and Reverend Page while we hash out the internet security moving forward. And I'll try to sneak in a tape recorder to share some of that content in a later episode. Reverend Page, what do you hope folks will do leaving today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that all those suggestions, I think are great ones. How can we continue to build bridges? I mean, not just do we have divisions that are online, but as just pointed out, divisions are actually geographic too. The whole big sort is a real thing. We live in different communities. I think this is exacerbated by continued gerrymandering in politics that sort of pulls people away from the center. So you can have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene actually have a seat in the House of Representatives, when she's come out and said, explicitly anti-Semitic things, and somehow she's not held accountable for this in a way that still shocks me. But on a personal level, I agree. I think it's education, it's relationships, and like for Christians to read a book like Constantine's Sword or something similar, where it's like understanding some of that history of anti-Semitism within the Christian church and how deeply it runs. I think a lot of people, even a lot of very sort of earnest Christians, just don't understand, the history there. To see some of the way in which Martin Luther's words. I mean, one of my really close friends is grew up Lutheran, and his parents worked in Missouri Synod Lutheran Church. And I mentioned to him about some of Luther's horribly anti-Semitic writings and how Hitler was using them and quoting from Martin Luther in the 1930s to justify all sorts of sort of anti-Semitic public policy. And he had never heard of it. He was a Lutheran. He grew up in a Lutheran church, had never heard of Luther's writings on these things. And so I think when Christians don't take the responsibility to try and learn some more of this and realize how this stuff is, as we said, not deep under the surface at all, that sort of sets self-awareness, I think, makes us realize, wow, this is actually more present than I was aware of. And I think that awareness will help us to hopefully fight it and recognize it and speak up.
Thank you, Reverend Page. Just before we weigh in, Scott, just since you inspired me, Reverend Page, and I don't know if soft drinks are the thing for me, but we could talk about what that would be. But I would recommend, I teach a class at the Seminary of the Southwest with my very good friend, Reverend Dr. Dan Jocelyn Sinatowski. We teach a class to seminarians called Undoing Anti-Judaism in the Church. And the great book that we've used, it's a little older, but it's about 10 years old now. It's called Anti-Semitism, it's called Anti-Judaism by David Nierenberg, who's a professor at University of Chicago. Nirenberg, David Nierenberg. And it speaks in one convenient volume, Reverend Page, about some of the embeddedness of this that we see in our culture and civilization. So thank you so much for raising that.
Thank you for the recommendation. I'm going to put it on my Amazon wish list right now.
All right. Friends of Reverend Page, you now have a suggestion for gifts moving forward. Rabbi Kasten, same question. What do you hope folks will do moving forward?
Well, I echo what's already been said. I think, again, to continue with our own personal actions, what we can do is really sort of challenge ourselves to be curious about others, even when they may offend us, and to not be, to push ourselves to ask questions, even when we are afraid to ask them. Ask people what they think of us, and ask people about things that we don't know about them. I think it takes a level of humility and then, the curiosity. And I think that if we bring that attitude to our own engagement in social media, not just in our one-on-one conversations and interactions, but also in our own engagement in social media, what we choose to post, what we choose to share, I think that we can make a difference, little by little. Do no harm is always a good motto, although, it's amazing sometimes things end up having unintended consequences. But then the last thing I would say is that I really do want to listen to young people on this. Some of you're probably all younger than I am, but, I think that people in their, 20s right now and early 30s are really, wrestling with a whole new world. And I do hurt for them. I do suffer for them. But I also think that some of them are coming up with really interesting ideas, and we need to be able to listen to those and not feel threatened by them, and recognize that, we may have to give some things up that we really like or that we're used to in order to pave the way for a new world in a nonviolent way.
And closing out this question, Renee, what do you hope folks will do moving forward?
I really want to reiterate what all of you have said. Sorry, because really good answers so far. But what I'm hearing is listening. This is what I'm hearing. I'm hearing listening, learning, right? And then so many of your members are leaders in various faith communities and challenging, I'm going to say, nicely, if challenging people to think differently. And I like the idea that Nancy was talking about also, is that youth look at the world and have such different lens than we all did, and their world picture is just so different. There's one resource for those who do want to learn. If you go to antisemitism.adl.org, it talks about the 7 different types of historic anti-Semitism, and it's just a really good primer for people. If you want to send them a quick link, just to get them started, and reiterate again how all hatred is linked and interwoven, and one leads to another, and encouraging our communities, all of our communities, to avoid finding bad in difference.
And Scott, if you don't mind me saying, I'm going to plug Texas Impact for a second, if you don't mind.
I'll never mind that. Yeah.
It was your call to action regarding the elections of 2020 that inspired me to want to get involved in the elections process as a judge and to work election days. And having done that in the last few elections, including the recent election in November, especially as we look towards new rules coming, I think that also is a very, very important thing to get involved in the process. And I was working towards the University of Texas at a polling site there. And many of the students who might have recognized me said, well, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm participating in democracy and trying to show with my own hours and my time of how important it is to actually know and see and get involved. And I think many of the students, just back to Rabbi Kasten and Renee, walked away saying, hey, I can do that too. And I think it's a really important thing. So I just want to applaud Texas Impact for making that accessible and something that is really important, that is something you can do and actionable regarding a preservation of our democracy.
Thanks. And thanks for doing that important work. I will say, since you brought it up, we're recording during the noon hour on November 15th. This last weekend, we did hold an election workshop event on this weekend, and we'll soon have the recording up from that on our YouTube channel. So keep an eye on that. You can take the election training yourself. So that's it. I really appreciate this conversation. Thank you all for doing it. I do want to give you just a quick second at the end. If you have any shameless plugs you want to make, you don't have to plug Texas Impact again, Rabbi Blumofe, but I appreciate that. Any shameless plugs you'd like to make or closing thoughts for us? I'm going to go to the order I see on the screen. Reverend Page, shameless plugs, closing thoughts.
No shameless plugs. Closing thoughts. I hope I do hope that that as we're coming out of COVID and as we're entering into the holiday season, that it really can be a time of coming together. I think that's one of the things that's nice about the holidays. And I think that particularly coming out of such a difficult time for our nation collectively, I do hope that it really is some of this healing can begin in the next couple of months.
I will join you in hoping for that. Rabbi Blumofe.
Thanks. And I appreciate that blessing, Reverend Page. And I echo it. I don't know if it's a shameless plug, but it's a plug of whatever community you're in, get involved in some of the interfaith work or some of the alliance building work, or if there isn't, maybe that's your New Year's resolution for 2022, because I think the world is in sore need of that kind of conversation and that kind of generosity. And I'll just add my prayers and hope for our continued consideration, thoughtfulness, compassion, engagement, and kindness.
Thank you, Rabbi. Renee.
I just want to say that my silver lining from this last month has been the community and the outpouring and the support of different faith communities has made all the difference. So this is more of a plug for gratitude. So thank everyone for including us and working with us, and it's very appreciated.
Thank you. And close us out, Rabbi Kasten.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you to all of the panelists. It's been really fun to get to interact with you. So Faith Commons is a multi-faith organization based in Dallas. We have a website, faithcommons.org, that I will recommend that you look at. We have monthly newsletters where we bring up topics of various kinds and try to look at them from different points of view. We have a lot of resources on our, along with our newsletters as well as on our website. And my shameless plug is that we are bringing Valerie Kaur to Dallas in early February, the night of February 2nd. Her appearance will be live streamed and also recorded. Ms. Kaur is a Sikh American, and that community has certainly seen a tremendous amount of violence against it. And she has a revolutionary love project. And we are highlighting that, and we are doing our part to try to build our own beloved community in the North Texas area, throughout Texas and beyond, with her other partners in revolutionary love. So you'll find that information on our website, but we are looking for other partners. So please be sure to join us on the evening of February 2nd for Valerie Kaur.
All right, friends. Well, once again, I really do appreciate your time today. But more than that, I really appreciate the work you're doing each and every day to make Texas a better place. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you for tuning in today. Friends, if you've stayed with us this long, I hope that you've enjoyed the content. Hope you enjoy Weekly Witness programming. So make sure that you leave us a rating or review. The highest rating, leave us a comment. We'll read some of those on air from time to time. That helps even more people find this content. And make sure that you're sharing it with your congregation, friends, and neighbors. And finally, keep an eye on Texas Impact social media and website for upcoming announcements or events. You can always email me at scott@texasimpact.org with questions or for more information. And remember, if you appreciate Texas Impact and the Weekly Witness community, make sure that you and your congregation are members by going to texasimpact.org/join. Friends, these are unprecedented times. It seems like every week we're having to talk about something else that's in the news cycle that requires our action. And so just another reminder before we close out today that the world needs Texans of faith, active and engaged, working for justice, working for equality, and we have a lot of work to do. So let's get to work.